So today we're here for a new talk in our Generative AI seminar series. So this is continuing on from 7 talks that we organized last year, which were very popular with staff, all exploring how online developments, or how ongoing developments rather, I should say, in generative AI are intersecting with learning, teaching, and academic work. And the whole idea, or one of the ideas, I suppose, is to bring together leading voices in academia and industry to open up discussion and generate ideas on the evolving role and impact of AI in higher education. So Peter's talk today is going to explore the disruptive impact of generative AI on assessment, integrity, policy, and student experience. That's just a bit of scene setting I think you're going to do. And then move on to highlight opportunities for creative and innovative practice. Peter, as many of you may know already, is Professor of Business Education and Associate Dean of Education at the University of Sydney Business School, and he brings over 30 years of experience in higher education across the UK and Australia, with expertise in strategy, educational innovation, digital learning, and creative industries. And before Sydney, he held leadership roles at the London School of Economics, University of Greenwich, and Middlesex University. His work is internationally recognized for bridging creative practice with practical change. I hope some of that sounds familiar.
It does.
Peter, we're going to run for about 45 minutes of a talk with some time left over then for questions. Speaking of which, those of you joining online, and I suppose those of you joining in the room as well, can pose questions using the Slido system. So just go to slido.com, enter that ID and put in your question, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. So without further ado, over to you, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a kind of, I won't say it's a continuation, but it's a development of some of the thinking we've been doing, not just at the University of Sydney, but as part of the research group that I'm a director of, which is the Disruptive Innovations in Business Education Research. But it's also something that's deeply impacting institutions all around the world. I find it really interesting that it is something that in every meeting I've been in, I'm on sabbatical at the moment, every meeting I've been in every institution I've visited over the last 3 weeks, that's been the question that's come up. Even this morning, talking to people here. So what's your view on generative AI? It's like almost the sort of fundamental thing we're talking about. Before I start, I just want to, this is something that we generally do in Australia, which is acknowledging the lands that the university is built on. Those lands are the traditional lands, in my case, for the University of Sydney, of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They've been custodians of that land for 60,000 years. I've put the picture there of a particular type of tree that's on our campus, that's from the campus of the University of Sydney. They're called the Gaddy tree, named after the people. And what those Gaddy trees are amazing is you can't plant them alone. If they're planted by themselves, they will die. They have to be planted with other Gaddy trees because their root systems intersect and interconnect. And in times of drought or in times of arid climate, they share nutrients, they share water between the clump and family of trees. So I think they're a really good metaphor for the way universities work. And they're certainly a good metaphor that we have learned at our university from the knowledge and practices of the First Nations people in Australia. That's the Slido. So I'm going to start with a simple question. Life's complex, right? Everything we do when it comes to higher education is a very complex thing. Learning is a complex process. It's not simple. If learning was simple, we would have one single way of teaching and that would work for everybody. It doesn't. Learning and teaching, research, all of the practices of an education institution are deeply, deeply complex. So when I'm talking about complexity, I'm talking about a few things here. I'm talking about how complexity challenges the way we manage competing interests. So, we can look at in every institution, and there's a competing interest between what we want to do and what we can afford to do. There are competing interests between research and teaching. There are competing interests between the university as a business and the university as a public good. These things are often quite riven by tension and not necessarily ever in alignment. What it does do for a lot of people in institutions is it fractures their certainty. So when things get so complex, certainty tends to become very difficult to ascertain and feel certain because you're in such waves of complexity and change. And it also creates paradoxes, these kind of tensions which are almost unresolvable in how we operate. And we were actually talking this morning with somebody around that notion of the fact that whilst we as academics often thrive in paradox, because that's what drives a lot of the disciplines that we're engaged with and a lot of thinking that we do, universities struggle with paradox because they're looking for certainty. And what a lot of people then look for is simplicity. Now, you can use as a synonym for simplicity, you look for certainty, you can look for direction, guidance, things I can rely on, rules, structures, policy, in that chaos and uncertainty. But complexity is part of the nature of higher education, part of the ways in which we are defined and structured. The next part of this is, do the crises that we're facing ever end? We are facing sequences of concurrent crises. They just often don't stop and don't give us a chance to reflect before the next one hits us. And you could then build into that the crises of regularity or the crises of normalcy, the things that we do every single semester when a new group of students start and all their troubles and challenges start to hit us at the same time as having to deal with AI, having to deal with recovery from COVID, having to, like, these crises roll over us. This is just some stuff that I pulled out of primarily the Australian media yesterday. We've got universities in Australia making up to 10% of their staff redundant. That's the University of Technology in Sydney, my alma mater, located just down the road from my university. We've got one of Australia's leading universities, the Australian National University, just fired their VC a couple of days ago and have been declared by our kind of regulator for work health and safety in the country to be psychologically unsafe for its staff. We've got situations where University of Macquarie, which is located about halfway out of Sydney, have basically going to shut down all of their humanities. Now, these are the crises in Australia caused by three things. One, by funding. One, by an over-reliance on international students and the demonisation of those international students by government. And the third one, of course, is the decreasing relevance of higher education to government as a social good. Now, that's particular in Australia. It is also happening in the UK. I like that one down in the bottom left there, which says Vice-Chancellor's job isn't to be liked, says the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Brighton, and that they want to make sure that all staff are aware of the seriousness of the financial situation that Brighton is in. The UTS one is particularly terrible because on top of firing 400 staff, they're also, they're firing 160, they're making 240 voluntary redundancies. They're also closing over 1,000 units of study and a couple of hundred, and I think it's 1,100 subjects to go, and they've paused about 300 programs, including, by the way, initial teacher education and the School of Public Health in two areas, which, surprise, surprise, are of the highest skill shortage in the country. I won't point out which major consulting company was paid 5 million Australian in order to tell them that, but it has 4 letters and one starts. One of those is a K. So, for those of you who were at my workshop yesterday, I did talk about this threat opportunity paradox, but I want to talk about it again because it's really important. This is one of my areas of expertise that I engage with when I talk about strategic management, not just from a perspective of higher education, but also from my disciplinary area of expertise, because I am actually an arts management scholar by trade. So, dealing with crisis is kind of fundamental to our lives. There's a writer called Nathan who talks about the threat opportunity paradox, and his argument is crisis is a threat. We talked about that right at the start. Complexity makes people feel uncertain. Crisis makes people feel uncertain, makes them feel precarious. It makes them feel at risk. It makes them feel fearful. We all felt that during COVID. We all felt that this might have been the end of universities. How is a university going to cope? And we did, of course we did. We did amazing stuff during that time. But there was still those feelings of maybe we'll just have to close down. I know certainly my university senate, similar to your academic council, said that their view was that we should have put every single person in the university on furlough and shut the university down for 2 years, because that would have been so much more financially viable. What we actually ended up doing was taking 5,000 more students. And that became far more financially viable. Crisis also represents that opportunity. That's the crisis. There's a threat in that crisis to all of us, and we could have been shut down, but there was an opportunity to take more students because we're online. We could help those poor students, particularly our international students who are trapped in mainland China. We could actually allow them to continue to study. We had whole groups of students who never attended face-to-face across multiple programs, particularly our postgraduate programs. But also crisis represents an opportunity for you to regrow, rejuvenate, rebuild what you're doing, reimagine what your attempts are. The story I told yesterday, but I'll tell again, is that the Australian First Nations people learned that you needed to burn the bush down. If you burnt the bush down, the bush regrew, it rejuvenated. You got rid of the dead wood, it sprouted again, the seeds dried, and the forest actually came back even bigger. They knew that was really important. It represented an opportunity for them to have the forest rejuvenate, bring the animals back, and then they were able to feed. But you can't have the opportunity without the threat, hence the paradox. So whilst crisis represents threat, it also is a massive opportunity. But it's not consequenceless. This was a study done by a number of Australian academics in 2023. What was so distressing about this study is two things. One's the data. 67% of Australian university employees experience poor psychosocial safety. 43% have extreme tiredness, anxiety, and depression. 66% suffered burnout. This was especially prevalent in women and especially prevalent in people in precarious employment, adjuncts, casuals, and the like. And around 3 in 5 respondents reported conflicts between their work, home, and family life. That's one reason that's incredibly distressing. But that, you look at the year 2023, that follows on from COVID, those figures have not improved in the subsequent reports they've done. What's equally distressing is that got into the media. It was gone and dusted in less than one media cycle. And universities refused to report it. They counterbalance that, my university included, with look at our staff survey results. Aren't they fantastic? This doesn't ring true in our staff survey results. But the crisis is never consequenceless. It always has a cost. I pose this question: why does higher education always need a crisis to reimagine the way we educate, research, and operate? Because it seems to me that, particularly in the last, I've been in higher education 30 odd years, the number of times that I've been in looking at how an institution chooses to reimagine itself outside of a crisis is far exceeded by the number of times it's chosen to reimagine itself after a crisis. That seems to be the common reason we have to do it. And I've attended a number of conferences in the last few years where all I hear people constantly say is, well, AI is happening now. This is our chance to reimagine. Well, why didn't we reimagine before? Why do we need a crisis to reimagine? Noting that crises are not consequenceless. They actually come with both the threat and the opportunity. There's a cost factor to engaging in a crisis. I talked a little bit in a blog post I wrote a couple of years back around the cadence, this notion of the cadence of crisis. The universities have actually sometimes got addicted to the notion of crisis. The crisis is sometimes a way to generate productivity, generate sort of collective bonhomie, that we're all in it together. It builds this culture and community. But each time you have a crisis, the recovery time gets longer. The damage that it does gets longer. And so the next question then is, and now I have to embrace AI? So that's, we've got complexity going on, which is our nature. We've got crises happening to us in successive, but now you're telling us I have to embrace AI. So I just pulled these out. They're quite small. I don't expect you to read them. This is from my LinkedIn feed today. I did have some wonderful headlines that I'd searched over the last couple of weeks. No, I've changed my mind. I went through the stuff for today. The first of these is a guy called Tim Fawns. He's an academic. He used to be at the University of University of Glasgow, now he's at Monash in Melbourne. He basically said that, I think you can be creative with AI. And he gets into this huge debate with a guy who's a learning designer who says, AI can never be creative. And this debate just goes on and on and on. There's like 400 comments. There's like there's 14 comments, but it's much longer now. This is a guy who works for the Australian Commonwealth government-funded science organisation called CSIRO. They have a group called Data 51. They're amazing. Data 61, sorry. He's written this amazing, this preliminary working draft of a paper that said, one of the reasons we can't understand AI and we can't understand it and rely on it in the same way we rely on a calculator is we know how a calculator works. We don't know how AI works. So how can we rely on it? And that there's the need for a human intervention or a human checking of this in order to feel that you're comfortable with the results. Kane Murdoch, who I think has been here and has talked, he works currently, I think, at Macquarie in Sydney. He's starting to talk today about the idea that, we don't want to believe that only a small percentage of students cheat. His view, and I actually disagree with him, and I've argued with him on this. He says that almost every student will want to avoid accountability for their learning if the opportunity presents itself. He's coming to the view that the group of students who learn for learning's sake is actually the small number. Now, he, in his job, is actually a academic integrity expert. So I can sort of see where he's coming from. I disagree with it. Bert Verhoeven works at the University of Newcastle in Australia. I've met him. He's a massive AI advocate, AI booster. He's come up with this idea of human-centric GenAI first pedagogy. He's invented his own pedagogy around it used to just be called GenAI first when I met him a year ago, but in a year's time, he's now come up, he wanted to add human-centric on the front of it. And this one is from my own university, Professor Danny Liu, who is extraordinarily excited that he's banned the banning of AI at the university, and that this will reduce the fear and the shame that students have in using it. I did include, does anyone know what movie that's from? That's from Footloose. That's from Footloose, because they banned the dancing of dancing. Yeah. That's all that came to my head. I nearly just put that picture in my comment to him, but instead I actually got into a bit of a debate. This is just today in my LinkedIn feed, and this is just 5 that I picked. This is what we are experiencing when we talk about generative AI, and this is what we are all having in our ecosystems around us in varying forms. And no matter whether we're talking about education, engagement, strategy, policy, industry, students, or research, it all comes back to AI. Everything seems to come back to it. Every discussion, every meeting I was in. When I'd been associate in education for 8 years. I stepped down from that role to go on to sabbatical a few weeks ago. I had my big farewell for this. The first thing my boss said was, she said 2 things. She was the dean of the business school. She said 2 things. She said, firstly, I had to write Peter's farewell speech using ChatGPT. Made me feel so warm. And the second thing she said is, well, Peter, I know this is in my farewell speech. I know you've always been a cynic about AI. And I'm like, no, I actually haven't been. But that's what ChatGPT told her to say about me. Just seemed very weird. Every conversation in every university, and I'm sure Garode talks about, has to have this in every meeting he goes in. What about AI? It's the most fundamental conversation we're having in universities. So just to give a bit of context, so I know people are coming to AI with a whole lot of different bits and pieces and knowledges. There are different generative AI products. We almost always talk about LLMs, large language models, ChatGPT and the like. There are a lot more than that. And there are a lot that function in very different ways to large language models, particularly in things like music, where they are often now controlling what are sort of digital audio workstations where they can overlay effects and mastering and all mixing on a musical project. They're very different in image production. They're really important in the teaching of things like architecture. They're being used a lot to sort of visualize in the 3D spaces. Very different to asking a question and getting an answer. And they all use different algorithmic premises. They're not all the same. So there is no one generative AI. Where the model's asked to produce a new output, just so most people know the way this works, it's all based on a prompt. The model finds patterns in the data that it has, in its training data. And from that, it will predict the most likely And the word I've added this morning was "and pleasing" response, because it wants to please you as the user. It wants to give you something that you feel happy with. And if you've used Claude or OpenAI or Copilot recently, it will actually ask you how happy you are with what they've provided. And these models often close circles. They often like to make two incongruous concepts seem quite seamless. And then by trying to do that, they make mistakes. I'm in one of my other areas of work that I do, which is around a creation of a fictional university. I asked it to take two completely incongruous concepts. One was the idea of critical theological interpretivism, which I know nothing about, but that's what I wanted it, in the world of a very fake, tiny little fake British crime drama that me and four mates made up at the pub. We're the only 5 people who know it. And I asked it to create a viable micro-credential about critical theological interpretivism through the lens of what this TV show is called Inspector Gareth Crime Central. And it did it. It closed that circle really reasonably effectively by just making everything up. But it came out as a really pleasing result. And if you want to see that, you can go to unibamford.com, and that micro-credential is on the site, and you can look at the video that AI wrote for us. So what this has done in a lot of institutions is it's created fractures in how we do things, because it creates polarized positions between people who think that this is the absolute right thing we should be doing, people who show levels of caution, people who show levels of skepticism, people who actually don't see it as relevant to their disciplines at all. But these are not new fractures. I took this out of Fortune magazine, so it's only literally from yesterday, where they took the age-old argument that professors think students are prepared for the workplace, and nearly half the students disagree and feel they're not ready for their entry-level jobs. That's been a debate we've been having for decades, but now that debate is through the lens of AI. So the actual article is actually talking about how apparently these students are telling whatever survey this was done that they're not ready because they're not got enough AI skill for the workplace. So this is from an amazing piece, and I've put the QR code there. This I cannot stress how important this actual editorial on N+1 magazine actually is. I've shared it around everybody all my networks, and people just going, I finally got someone who actually explains the challenges of AI in higher education in really clear, precise language. And the reason I really like this piece is that it is written not by academics, but by people who understand our sector. So they're journalists around our sector. But I just put this quote here, which I think is really important. The temptation to resign ourselves to resignation is never stronger than at a time of overlapping crises. So got all these concurrent crises, and this is where like, oh, fine, just do it. I'll just do whatever you just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. The AI upheaval is unique in its ability to metabolize any number of dread-inducing transformations. The university is going more corporate, or it's politically oppressive. This is obviously written from an American perspective, and all but hostile to the humanities, which you saw from some of those Australian stories. And yes, but also every student gets their own chatbot. So it just creates these kind of really challenging dichotomies. I strongly urge you to read that article, and I'm sure we can get that sent around to everyone who's attended, because it really does go into, I think, some of the emotional context of what this means for us and our identity as people who work in a university. So what I want to do in the next section of this presentation is actually talk about some of the wicked problems that AI is creating. So those kind of dread-inducing transformations. And this will be a bit of skipping through some examples of where this is making itself manifest in the debates around AI. So I want to start with integrity, criticality, and the role of the human. These things come up really regularly in discussions around AI. AI is integrity for assessment, the criticality. We've got to have the skills to know what AI tells us is right or wrong. We've got to have the critical skills to ask the right questions. And what is the role of the human in higher education? I showed you Bart Verhoeven's piece about human-centric AI-first pedagogy and the fact that he added the human-centric because he needed to find a role for the human. It would be a terrible circumstance, and I got mocked for this when I actually said this at a senior leadership meeting, that imagine if our learning outcomes are written by AI, all our materials are written by AI, everything on our LMS was written by AI, we write our assignments by AI, we create our rubrics by AI. The students then write their assignment using AI, and then we get AI to mark it and give them feedback. I actually tried that out. Once again, part of my fictional university, we have a micro-credential that actually works. And we did that all the way through. Every single thing I did using AI. Now, it's an area I have expertise, so the role of human is at least I understand what questions to ask. But it was fascinating when I submitted, I got AI to write the answers to the two assignments against the rubric that we created in the question, and then I got two different AI platforms to mark it. Like humans, they gave it two separate marks. One gave it a distinction, the other one failed it.
Oh my God.
So quite big variation there. So it's really about that. This particular wicked problem is really about the human capabilities that we need to develop and inspire. Because if we don't have a human in the system, then why have students in the system? Why have people teaching? Why are humans going to go and end up working in organisations? Where are their jobs going to be? This is a quote from a piece about bias in generative AI, which I've used a few times now. But as our reliance on AI intensifies, it becomes imperative to ensure fairness and equity in the design of these technologies. It's not just about what is the role of the human in a predefined AI world. It is how does the human define the AI world? How does the human set the ethics, structures, and guidelines of the AI world? Because if all we are doing is reacting to the AI, then that's not a human skill or capability. But if we are the ones determining that, and it's really fascinating, that guy who I showed you the article by Zhao from the CSIRO in Australia, when you actually read through his paper, he's talking about the fact that not even the people at OpenAI or Anthropic know how AI is working. It's actually doing things they don't know why it's doing it, because it is effectively such a data-driven model. It's an algorithmic-driven model that is behaving in ways they are not yet sure how it works. I'm sure they understand the sort of biomechanics of it, or the technological mechanics of it. But when you talk to Sam Altman from OpenAI, he will tell you he actually doesn't really know how this whole thing works, which is worrying. So this sort of points to the fact that we actually need to take responsibility in actually setting those parameters. This is from my Pro Vice Chancellor Education, Professor Adam Bridgman. He says, so this is what my university's been doing. That's my building in Sydney. If we do not change our assessments to align them with the capabilities of generative AI, our degrees will be easy to pass and we will have failed to prepare our students. So he's taking the opposite perspective. We must embrace AI in everything we do. And my university, as you saw from Danny Liu's piece about banning the banning, we have gone very AI first. So for him, he sees it as a way of students are going to use it to pass, therefore our degrees lose validity if we don't do something about it. So he sees the human intervention is setting policy and practice. This is a quote from Phil Dawson. The first part is a quote from Phil Dawson. He is a professor of academic integrity at Deakin University. And he says, AI is not a crisis of cheating. It is a crisis of learning. Now, I added the assessment or research or student experience or procurement, however you want to see it. So his view is this is actually a challenge for us as people who design learning and teaching, not necessarily people who are trying to prevent students cheating. So Adam Bridgman sort of took the prevention of cheating view. At my university, he takes the perspective this actually needs to be about us rethinking our assessment processes and rethinking the way we do learning and teaching so that AI is a tool for that, not the thing that we're trying to prevent or simply enable through AI fluency and AI literacy. However, this is not what's the word I'm probably looking for? This is not an openly safe space for institutions. because we have things like Turnitin, who are one of the major providers for higher education, delivering an addition to their product late August, which was a AI bypasser detector. So what this actually means is that a lot of students have worked out that if they write their work with AI, they can run it through another AI that makes it undetectable for anyone to spot that it's AI. It's not too hard on a prompt. You just write this so it doesn't sound like AI. That's the simple prompt. AI doesn't always, the LLM doesn't always agree with that, but anyway. We've got Canvas starting to look about building OpenAI into Canvas as a platform. And this is also Danny Liu. I don't have an obsession with Danny Liu, I promise, but let's keep an eye on my time. Cool. He developed a agentic teaching bot called Cognity, and he declares that that's the stunt double for the academic. So what you're meant to do is go in and give the teaching bot your personality and your interests and your knowledge, and then they will be available 24/7 to the student, replicating exactly what you would do, but not having to be awake at 3 a.m. when the student's concerned about what their assignment needs to look like. So, and that was in one of Australia's major newspapers. So this is not a neutral space. There is a lot going on here where vendors are starting to interact into this, where the instruments of our teaching are starting to be impacted. And then you obviously have the institutional arguments that go along with that. This is something I discovered yesterday. This is Claude, which is the LLM that Anthropic have put together. They're now paying students money up to $1,750 American program stipend, that pre-tax, for the student to either become an ambassador for Claude. So they run sessions, tell their fellow students about it, encourage their fellow students to use Claude, and encourage their fellow students to give feedback to the teacher they should be using Claude in their classroom, and then also building communities and helping other students to learn how to use Claude as a platform. They are not alone. OpenAI has it, Figma has it, Adobe has it. At the moment, we're counting around 15 of the major edtech or social media-enabled platforms that are supporting education all have some form of campus ambassador program. And what that actually does is this. You've got a vendor who is effectively bypassing the university to go directly to the student to do advocacy, community building, how to use the product, get help and support on using the product, and build brand loyalty to that particular product. They're expecting that the student will then, when they go into their job, sell the same product to the company they're working for. This is being deployed in many leading universities around the world. Mainly, they're targeting the top echelon of universities because they're going into the top companies. On the other hand, industry gets to build a direct customer relationship with the vendor. Once again, bypassing at a university level all our knowledge of pedagogy, all our knowledge of policy, all our knowledge of practice, and all our expertise in research and understanding is being bypassed. Now, this is not uncommon. If anyone's from library land, this has been happening with library vendors for decades. So this is not new, but every one of the generative AI platforms are doing this. The next wicked challenge is what I call the slow descent. This is the notion that AI trained on its own data eventually collapses because there might be 0.1% of error every time. You introduce 0.1% of error into another thing, that 0.1 grows and grows and grows exponentially. It's the proliferation of low-quality media, poorly realised content, or generally trashy AI based on social media and the internet. I picked that picture purposely because that picture was actually in a major newspaper, published in a major newspaper, and ran around the world. And you might notice the problem with the picture. Way too many fingers. Way too many fingers. But the newspaper thought that was fine. No problems with that. Now you'll notice a lot of newspapers make sure they say that this content has been AI generated for that particular reason. I found this earlier in the week, and I find this really company. This is a company called Inception Point AI. They produce over 5,000 podcasts, different podcasts, with over 3,000 episodes a week. Every single bit of it is AI generated. There's no humans involved in it at all. AI generated scripts. They do one on a tourist guide to Sydney. So the show I got this off is a media show. It said, when we listened to this, we thought we're going to listen to this so you don't have to. Halfway through the first episode, the AI stopped talking about Sydney, the city, and started talking about Sydney Sweeney, the actress. And did like this 15-minute piece in the middle about how bad the controversies around her are after her Gene ad and her supporting conservative movements. The founder of this company says, I think people who are still referring to AI-generated content as slop are probably lazy Luddites. So there's a real polarization that comes from this, but the more errors get introduced, that's their advertising, by the way. I find it really scary. They cook, they gossip, they teach, they perform. And that's all AI generated. This is what Vulture refers to as slop for your ears. That's a good example of slop, but this just gets more and more and more. And the reason it was on an Australian media show was a number of Australian news outlets, including the Daily Mail, picked up content from this and reported it as news. Slop becomes slop becomes slop. And for us, this is a particular challenge, because if we see this through the lens of research, gradually our research becomes less and less reliable, because the more the data is built on slop or built on bad training data or the hallucinations or whatever you want to call them, the more challenge that our research has, and the less value, according to Dirk Lindenbaum, who's a professor of organisation theory at Bath University, the less value we apply to truth, because there is different versions of truth. And as a researcher, truth is kind of important for what we do. The next challenge I talk about is the productivity spiral. I love this piece. This is from last year. I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so I can do my laundry and dishes. Yeah. There are different views around the world about what is productivity, what is important for productivity. You will find that when you talk to institutions, they talk about the removal of repetitive tasks. But some of those removal of repetitive tasks, for example, are marking students' assignments. As much as I find marking tiring and difficult and boring, it's one of the most important jobs I do. I don't want to hand that over to someone else. I need to do that. In terms of research, if you look at the way productivity is being seen through the research lens, look at all the processes in the research world that have now got impacts on, been impacted by AI. Reviews of journal articles. There's a huge issue with journal articles coming back reviewed by AI. I find it, as an editor of a journal, I find that really hard, but it's really common. The design of your research, the writing of your research, the analysis of your research. In medical research, the big issue at the moment is the creation of fake data sets using AI. There's on predicted human behavior or predicted biological behavior or predicted chemical behavior, creating fake data sets and then having articles written on the fake data set to validate. It's quite frightening. And at what point, we talk about, there's this thing called model collapse in AI, which is basically the more slop you have, the more eventually the AI model will collapse. At what point do we in institutions have labour collapse? That there are certain things that we just, that institutions eventually don't need humans to do. It's an interesting point. It's highly theoretical at the moment. There's a few people writing about it in the future of work, in the literature around future of work. They think that the labour collapse will hit casualised, adjunct, precarious workers first. Logically and terribly. But that's where the predictions are coming from people who write about potential labour collapse. This is a thing from Blue Sky. I've used this a few times. What $1 trillion problem is AI trying to solve? Wages. It's granted, highly cynical. I do take that, but I do think there is an element of that, because that notion of we will relieve you from repetitive tasks. We will make your life easier. The next wicked challenge is this notion of taking sides or finding the between. I won't go through this in any great depth, but at the moment, if you look at the way the debate happens, and you saw that in some of the LinkedIn posts I have, at one side you've got people who are very pro-AI. They're boosters of AI. They're talking about it as if it changes the world. The other side, as in anything, you have resistors, people who don't want to do AI. What lies in between is what Ella calls the abundant betweenness. And in the abundant betweenness, we're looking to connect others who feel equally uncertain as us, connect others who feel like they're out of control. It is very similar to the notion of liminality, this almost overused word in academia. Liminality is a little bit more about a social state. This is much more about an organizational or work state, that you sit in this abundant between. The majority of people are in the abundant between. Yet if you're in the booster area, you believe everything to the right of you is you're all resisting. You're Luddites. And in fact, the article I pointed you to earlier is called Large Language Muddle, The Rise of the Luddites. It's okay to be called a Luddite. That was the subtitle. And then resistors believe everything to the right of them is they're being uncritical and they're buying into the hype. But the reality is we're all in this abundant between. But there's this kind of thing where you have to take sides, because every single thing we're talking about is about AI. You have to have a position. You have to have a view on it. I took these two because I think they're really interesting. This is Brian Knowles, who wrote a piece called 4 Kinds of Silencing. He said, I mostly see this kind of silencing when claims of AI's untrustworthiness are derided as hopelessly naive, when people are told that they can complain, but AI is progress and can't be stopped. Don't like what generative AI is doing to education? Well, tough. You'd better adapt. And so he was talking about this in the ways of the way critics and critique is silenced. This one is a billboard that was in San Francisco last week, which a vendor puts up. AI agents are humans too. To even fight back against the fact that they're not bots, they're not robots, they're not machines. They're humans. They can think, they can feel. They're for real world usages. Look, they're even making a thumb heart. How human's that? And you're getting so much of this anthropomorphization of AI, about the taking sides. Final one I want to talk about is Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha is a generation that were born from 2013 on. They're not in higher education yet. They're not going to be in higher education for the next 5 years. They are the first generation born entirely within the 21st century. They are primarily kids of millennials, not exclusively, but primarily kids of millennials. Their millennial parents are the strongest influence on them about whether they feel heard and validated, whether they need to stand up for their beliefs and celebrate individuality and diversity while also ensuring their safety. They have moved through their compulsory environment in a highly digital environment. They also did that part increasingly because almost every one of them have had their education impacted by COVID. So they spent 2 years online. But they also they are the first generation to have immediate access to information from the day they were born. So they've had so much capability of being able to just pick up the internet and get immediate answers to them. Either they ask their parents, is the sky blue? And their parents look up the internet to do that. Or at the age where they're able to use the device, they can look up that answer for themselves. And it is predicted that one out of two of these will end up in higher education. But then you start to see stories like this. This is out of one of your own papers from earlier, from I think July, that the government's considering rolling out ChatGPT to all the schools. In Australia, state of South Australia, it's about 2.5 million people. They've just rolled out Microsoft's new ChatGPT product called EdChat to every single high school. So students will have AI available to them as conversational bots to give them answers, to be their friend, their mentor, their collaborator, their pal. And that will be done at a school level. Think of the consequences of just staff training to get that to the point where the human, the criticality, and those questioning skills come into that. Because that means training teachers all the way up to that. to that level. It's a real challenge. So I'm going to pose you 2 questions to finish up. Can we use AI and whatever technologies follow it to help humans make higher education better in ways we could never imagine? This is the positive version of this. There are benefits. I am not a Luddite. I'm not in the resistor box. I'm definitely in the abundant between because I love the notion of third spaces. I think they're really important. And there are third spaces here that we can do stuff with. Most of the images that I've used today have been created using AI. Not by me, but by Adobe. Adobe sells them as part of Adobe stock. I use them. They're great. They really illustrate what I'm trying to do in ways that I could never have done. I could never have created a man on a boat with sharks following him. That was cool. That was great. So there are possibilities here. And can we redesign our institutions to help staff, students, and their partners, whether it's industry or government, to understand and design for the massive change necessary to respond to the critical challenges facing society, but not just AI, but climate change and inequality and war and all of the things affecting us. Because in reality, if all of us as institutions talk about AI, we're not talking about our role in all those other crises, and they end up getting lost. So it's a really important thing that we actually nut this out really quickly, get to where we want to be, and actually get back to doing what we should be doing, which is actually trying to solve some of the biggest challenges in society. I want to finish with Greek philosophy. Always good to finish on a high positive note with a bit of Greek philosophy. Heraclitus came up with this notion of what he called the pantarei, which is everything flows. The simplest model of everything flows is when you have your feet in a river, the water that's at your feet is never the same. It's always moving past you. But the translation roughly goes that process is fundamental. The river is not an object, but a continuing flow. There's no single river. It always changes. The sun is not a thing, but an enduring fire. Everything is a matter of process, of activity, of change. Not stable things, but fundamental forces and the varied fluctuating activities they manifest constitute the world. We're always going to have complexity. We are always going to have crisis. It's finding a way through those and actually encouraging our students to build the capacities and capabilities to do that. So I really like that notion of the pantarei. I think everything flows is a really important thing to say, that it's not just about the first job for students. It's not just about what grade they get in the next unit. It's about the skills and capabilities they develop across the rest of their lives. So thank you.
Thanks to everyone for coming along, people in the room and people online.
Thank you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you.